By the mid-1960s, John Lennon and Bob Dylan were no longer just musicians. They were symbols. Two men who defined the language of a generation. Dylan wrote with fire and poetry, Lennon with irony and confession. They admired each other and competed with each other. But beneath the friendship and mutual respect was rivalry, the kind only geniuses can understand. And in one rare moment of candor, John Lennon said there was a Beatles song that Bob Dylan could never top. A song, he said, that was far better than anything Dylan had written. That song was Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown. The story began in 1964, when the Beatles met Bob Dylan for the first time at the Delmonico Hotel in New York. The meeting was legendary, two worlds colliding. Dylan introduced them to marijuana. The Beatles introduced him to fame on a scale he could barely imagine. But what mattered most to John Lennon wasn't the drugs, it was Dylan's words. He'd never heard songs written with that kind of honesty. Dylan's lyrics weren't about teenage love. They were about life, about frustration, fear, and philosophy. Lennon went home inspired and intimidated. He said later, "I didn't know you could write like that until Dylan showed me." That influence changed everything. By 1965, Help had marked the end of the Beatles' innocence. Their next record, Rubber Soul, would mark the beginning of something deeper, and Norwegian Wood was its heartbeat. Norwegian Wood was unlike anything the Beatles had recorded before. It wasn't loud or cheerful. It was quiet, mysterious, and laced with tension. The lyrics told the story of a man spending the night, or almost spending the night, with another woman. A hint of desire, a touch of guilt, and an ending left to interpretation. John described it as my first real personal song. It was written during a period when his marriage was strained and fame had turned his life into a maze of contradictions. It was about an affair I had, he admitted later, disguised in metaphors so no one would know. The honesty shocked even him, but it was wrapped in beauty. The sitar, played by George Harrison, added a strange, dreamlike tone that made the song feel timeless. It was Lennon's way of writing like Dylan, but sounding like no one else. When Rubber Soul was released in December 1965, Bob Dylan was at his creative peak. He just released Highway 61 Revisited, an album that redefined rock with songs like a Rolling Stone and Desolation Row. Critics compared the two constantly. Dylan, the prophet of words, Lennon, the master of melody. But John wasn't just following Dylan, he was challenging him. Years later, when asked about the influence, Lennon didn't hide it. "Sure, Dylan inspired me," he said, "but Norwegian Wood was me doing Dylan better." He wasn't bragging, he was making a point. To Lennon, Dylan's genius was in his lyrics, but his melodies were often secondary, almost accidental. Lennon believed a song should be both, emotionally raw and musically perfect. That's what Norwegian Wood achieved. It took the spirit of Dylan's storytelling and placed it inside a framework of beauty and control. It was art meeting craft, passion meeting precision. In an interview years later, Lennon was asked whether Dylan ever wrote a song that matched Norwegian Wood. He smiled and said, "No, not really, that one's far better." It wasn't arrogance, it was truth as Lennon saw it. He knew Dylan could paint with words, but he also knew the Beatles could create worlds with sound, and Norwegian Wood was proof of that balance. Where Dylan's songs wandered, Lennon's arrived. Where Dylan preached, Lennon whispered. The song's structure, 2 minutes, 2 verses, no chorus, was simplicity, hiding complexity. The sitar drone, the unresolved ending, the ambiguity of the final line. "So I lit a fire. Isn't it good, Norwegian Wood?" It was storytelling through tone, not message. Even Dylan noticed. He responded with Fourth Time Around a year later, a clear imitation of Lennon's song, complete with nearly identical phrasing. John laughed when he heard it. "I thought he's doing me doing him." The rivalry had come full circle. Producer George Martin immediately recognized Norwegian Wood as a turning point. It wasn't just a new song, it was a new Beatles. He said, "It was the first time John revealed himself, the real John, behind the image." Martin's arrangement, delicate, sparse, intimate, gave Lennon the space to breathe. There was no orchestra, no wall of sound, just voice, guitar, and sitar, three elements perfectly balanced in tension. When Lennon heard the final mix, he reportedly said, "That's it. That's the sound in my head." And Martin replied simply, "It's honest, John. That's why it works." Norwegian Wood changed everything, not just for the Beatles, but for rock music itself. It proved that pop could be subtle, introspective, and literary. That emotion could live inside simplicity. Bob Dylan respected it deeply. In interviews, he described it as clever, though his tone suggested admiration mixed with envy. He understood that Lennon had captured something he couldn't: clarity through minimalism. John never gloated. He loved Dylan too much for that. But he knew what he'd achieved. "We were all borrowing from each other," he said. "But that was mine. That was me finding my voice." And that voice, quiet, ironic, and painfully human, would shape the rest of Lennon's life. In the end, Norwegian Wood wasn't about rivalry. It was about realization. The moment John Lennon stopped trying to sound like anyone else. He had taken Dylan's influence and transformed it into something purer, something universal. Bob Dylan taught Lennon to speak truth, but Lennon taught the world that truth could sing. Isn't it good, Norwegian Wood? For John Lennon, it wasn't just good, it was far better.